All right, buckle up, everyone. We're about to go deep on strategic domain-driven design. Specifically, we're tackling bounded contexts today. And judging by the material you sent, we're going way beyond DDD 101 here.
Yeah. You know what's really cool about strategic DDD? It fundamentally changes how we think about developing software. We're not just focused on modeling the domain anymore. We're tackling the complexity of how we as developers approach problems. And, bounded contexts, they're at the core of that whole shift.
So hold on, we're not just drawing lines in the sand, right? It's not simply about technical boundaries, because the source material really hammered home the point that language plays a huge role. There's this whole ubiquitous language thing. Did that jump out at you too?
Oh, absolutely. Ubiquitous language it's critical. What it means is everyone involved in a bounded context, and I mean everyone, developers, domain experts, everyone, use the exact same terms.
Yeah.
So think about it. We're all on the same page, right?
Yeah.
No more miscommunication, less chance of errors, less time wasted trying to figure out what each other is saying.
It's like ensuring we're all speaking the same dialect within that specific context. Okay, that clicks. But then the source material also says that sometimes, get this, repeating yourself in the code can actually be a good thing, in this context at least. I mean, that seems to go against everything I've learned about clean code.
Yeah, see, that's where things get really interesting. It's not that repeating yourself is, inherently wrong. It's more about recognizing that each instance of that repeated element might represent different knowledge within its own bounded context. They're not, actual duplicates. They're more like different facets of the same concept tailored to that context's specific needs.
Okay, can you give me a concrete example of that? I'm having trouble visualizing it.
Sure. Think about an online bookstore, right?
Yeah.
We might have different bounded contexts for, say, the catalog, the inventory, and the delivery process. Now, in the catalog, a book might just be about the title, the author, a description, that kind of thing. But over in the inventory, it's all about quantities and storage locations. And then when you get to the delivery context, that same book becomes a physical object with weight and shipping details and all that.
Okay, I get it. So even though we're using the word book in each context, what we actually mean by book, like the information that matters, changes based on where we are in the system.
Exactly. Each context needs its own specific view of that book concept to function effectively.
Yeah.
If we try to force one universal definition, we end up with a model that's either too generic to be useful or so complex it becomes, a nightmare to work with.
All right, that makes sense. But I'm still a little fuzzy on something. The source material also talks about these things called subdomains, and they seem closely related to bounded contexts. How do they fit into the picture?
Right. That's a point where a lot of people get tripped up. It's easy to mix them up. So think of it this way. Subdomains are part of the problem space, right? They're about what needs to be solved. Bounded contexts, on the other hand, they live in the solution space, focusing on how we solve those problems technically.
So subdomains are about understanding the business, and bounded contexts are about how we build the software to actually support that business.
You got it. Ideally, you'd have a one-to-one relationship between subdomains and bounded contexts. But in the real world, things aren't always that clean. You might have a bounded context covering multiple subdomains, or a subdomain split across several bounded contexts. And that's where things can get messy.
So how do we know if we've defined our bounded context correctly? Like, what are some red flags, things that tell us we might need to adjust those boundaries?
Well, the source material gives us 6 heuristics to help validate those boundaries. Think of them as guidelines, not hard and fast rules, but really useful for spotting potential problems and ensuring our bounded contexts are well defined.
Okay, break those down for me. Let's start with the first one, autonomy, right?
Right. Autonomy basically means that a bounded context should be able to function independently as much as possible. It shouldn't need to constantly rely on other contexts to do its job.
So going back to our bookstore example, our catalog-bounded context should be able to tell me the price of a book without having to check with the inventory context if it's in stock, right?
Exactly. It should have all the information it needs to do its own thing.
Sure. What about the second heuristic? What's that all about?
The second one is about the number of contexts that are involved in a specific business process. Ideally, we want to keep that number small. If a process has to touch too many different bounded contexts, it gets more complex, harder to understand, harder to maintain, and way more prone to errors.
So, like, adding something to your shopping cart shouldn't require bouncing between 5 different bounded contexts. That would be a bad sign.
You got it. That would definitely suggest that maybe those boundaries aren't quite right. Maybe they're too granular. Maybe those 5 contexts could be combined into one that focuses on, shopping cart stuff specifically.
All right, I'm starting to get how these heuristics can be useful in spotting potential issues. What's the third one?
The third one focuses on information that changes together. If you have data that always needs to be updated in sync across two different bounded contexts, it's a pretty good clue that those contexts might actually belong together.
So if the price of a book changes, it needs to be updated in both the catalog and the inventory, right? They're linked.
Exactly. That strong coupling suggests maybe, just maybe, those two aspects should be in a single bounded context.
Okay, this is making a lot of sense. What's next on the list?
The fourth one asks us to look at information that's used together a lot, even if it doesn't change together. If you contexts are constantly swapping data back and forth, it could be a sign that those boundaries aren't quite right.
Okay, give me a scenario where that might pop up.
Sure, let's say we're building software for an insurance company, right? You might start with separate bounded contexts for selling policies and for handling claims. But then, as you go along, you realize that customer policy information is constantly going back and forth between those two.
So instead of having them constantly talking, you might rethink the organization. Maybe create context based on the type of insurance, like home, auto, or life insurance, instead of separating by sales and claims.
You got it. It's about finding those natural groupings of data and functionality that minimize the dependencies between contexts, make things flow better.
All right, I like these heuristics. Very practical. What about the fifth one?
Okay, this one gets a little more abstract. It's about using anti-requirements to test your boundaries. Basically, these are requirements that would make zero sense in the real world. They help us confirm that our boundaries are actually reflecting the real nature of the domain.
I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example of that? Like, how does a nonsensical requirement help?
Okay, back to our bookstore. An anti-requirement might be, we can't allow returns if a book was, stored on a specific shelf in the warehouse.
Well, that's ridiculous. Where it's stored shouldn't affect returns at all.
Exactly, and that's the point. If we can't come up with any realistic scenarios where information or functionality would need to be shared between contexts in that kind of crazy way, it reinforces the idea that our boundaries are actually well-defined.
That is a clever approach, I'll give you that. What's the last heuristic then? Number 6.
This one's about spotting schizophrenic contexts. It's a term for a bounded context that's trying to do way too many things or serve conflicting purposes, like it can't decide what it wants to be.
So it's a context that lacks focus, right?
Yeah.
Trying to wear too many hats.
Exactly. Classic example, you have a customer management context that's trying to handle both individual customers and, corporate accounts. Totally different rules and processes for each. Instead of this one context constantly switching gears, it'd be cleaner to have two separate ones, each focused on a specific customer type.
Makes things simpler, easier to manage. Each context has its own clear set of rules, doesn't need to constantly figure out who it's dealing with.
Exactly. It's all about those clear boundaries, creating contexts that have a specific and well-defined purpose.
These are great, these heuristics. They give you a real framework to work with to see if those bounded contexts are properly defined. Now, earlier you mentioned that defining them is an iterative process. What did you mean by that?
Oh, yeah, we don't expect to get those bounded contexts perfect right off the bat, right?
No.
It's a process of discovery, refinement, and sometimes even restructuring. It takes time.
So you start with an initial set based on your understanding of the domain, and then use these heuristics to evaluate, tweak, refine them over time.
Exactly. And as you learn more about the domain, as those business requirements change, you might need to revisit those bounded contexts and make further adjustments.
It sounds very flexible, very adaptable. Now, the source material also includes this detailed case study about defining bounded contexts for an online course platform.
Oh, that case study it's gold. It really shows how these concepts work in a practical setting.
Before we get into that, though, can you give me a quick rundown on what event storming is? The source material mentions it as, a key technique for defining bounded contexts, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
Of course, of course. Event storming is this collaborative workshop technique that helps you understand and model complex business processes. You get a group of people from different parts of the organization, developers, domain experts, business stakeholders, and you visually map out the flow of events that happen within a specific domain, like a big brainstorming session.
So you're identifying all the key events that happen in a particular area of the business.
Exactly. And by mapping those events out, you start to see patterns and relationships. You see the different actors involved, the information that's exchanged, the dependencies.
And this helps you identify potential bounded contexts because you see those natural groupings of events and actors that might indicate different areas of functionality.
Precisely. Event storming can be really powerful for uncovering those hidden boundaries and really understanding the domain. It's like a window into the heart of the system.
No, the case study specifically uses something called process-level event storming. Is that different from regular event storming?
That's a good question. Yes, there are different types of event storming. Process-level event storming is more focused. It zooms in on a particular problem area within the domain. You're using it to design a software solution for a specific business challenge.
So you're not trying to understand the entire business process. You're focusing on a specific area where you need to, say, improve efficiency or solve a particular problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the case study, the problem they're trying to solve is this long, drawn-out process for producing their online courses.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into that case study. Where do they start? What are the first steps they take?
Well, before they even start brainstorming solutions, they do something really smart. They quantify the problem with some key metrics. Specifically, they look at the time it takes to edit an episode of a course and the associated costs. They want to measure it.
So instead of just saying, this takes too long, they actually put numbers to it.
Exactly. They even define clear goals and limits for those metrics. For example, they want to cut editing time by 50%, and they're willing to invest, say, $5,000 in a new editing tool if it can achieve that goal.
It's like they're setting targets for their solution design. Otherwise, they're just shooting in the dark.
You got it. They're being very deliberate. And this is where the process-level event storming comes in. They bring together a team, developers, course creators, editors, and they start mapping out the entire workflow for creating an episode of an online course. Every step.
And this is where they start to identify those potential bounded contexts.
Exactly. As they walk through that process, they see those natural groupings of events and actors. They see where information gets exchanged, where decisions are made, where dependencies exist. And that leads them to their initial set of bounded contexts.
Can you give me some examples of the bounded contexts they identify? Like, what do those look like?
Sure. Some are pretty straightforward, like a course content context, which would handle everything related to creating and managing the actual content of the courses. And then there's a user management context, handling accounts, permissions, all that stuff.
Right. Those align with the subdomains you might expect in an online course platform. But you mentioned earlier that bounded contexts don't always emerge in such obvious ways. Did they find any that were less obvious in this case study?
Oh, they did. And this is where it gets really interesting. As they're mapping out the process, they realize that information about whether a course can be watched by a given user is scattered all over the place across multiple contexts, not centralized.
So it's not just about who the user is or what the course content is. There's more to it, more factors involved in whether they have access.
Exactly. Things like whether they've enrolled, whether they've met the prerequisites, if the course is currently available, all sorts of things. And they realize that this scattered information is creating complexity and potential for errors. It's a mess.
So they decide to create a dedicated bounded context just for managing course availability.
That's right. They call it the course availability context. And this context becomes the single source of truth for determining whether a user can watch a particular course. No more guessing.
That's a great example of how digging into the details of a specific process can lead to the discovery of bounded contexts you might not have anticipated. And I imagine having this dedicated context simplifies things for the other contexts, right? They don't have to worry about it anymore.
Absolutely. Instead of each context having to check all these different conditions, they can simply ask the course availability context for a yes or no answer. Much cleaner.
It's a great example of how using those heuristics can lead to a much more streamlined design. Now, what about the impact of team structure on all of this? The source material mentions this thing called Conway's Law.
Conway's Law. It's fascinating. It highlights how human organization and technical design are connected. Basically, it says that the structure of a software system will often mirror the structure of the organization that built it. It's like the reflections of each other.
So if you want to create systems with, well-defined, autonomous, bounded contexts, it helps to have teams that are structured around those contexts. Like each team owns a context.
Exactly. That's the ideal scenario. A dedicated team for each bounded context. That gives the team ownership, they can make decisions quickly, iterate fast, without being bogged down by dependencies on other teams.
But what if you don't have that luxury? What if you have a smaller team that's responsible for, several contexts? That seems like a challenge.
It can be, yeah. But even then, you can still use Conway's law to your advantage.
How so? What can you do?
Well, instead of just accepting that your organizational structure is going to dictate your software design, you can be more proactive. Think
Oh.
about how you organize your teams, your development processes, to better align with the architecture you want.
So even if you can't have perfectly aligned teams, you can create an environment that encourages clear boundaries and autonomy.
Exactly. You can use technical practices, tooling, to reinforce those boundaries.
Yeah.
Think modularity in your code base, well-defined APIs between contexts, even separating code into different repositories. Like, build those fences in your code.
It's like building those fences to stop those unintended dependencies from creeping in. I like that.
Right. And it shows that bounded contexts aren't just about technical boundaries. They're also about communication patterns, team dynamics, even organizational culture. It's a bigger picture thing.
It's a holistic approach that takes into account all those different factors that affect how software gets made.
Precisely. And that's what makes it such a powerful concept. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off, exploring those bounded contexts.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes we run into mismatches between those bounded contexts and the subdomains. We talked about how that happens in real-world projects, but I'm curious about what that actually means, practically speaking. What kind of challenges do those mismatches create?
That's where things can get a little tricky. Yeah, when those mismatches happen, you often see a jump in complexity. The dependencies between different parts of the system, they start to get out of hand. For example, let's say you've got a bounded context that's trying to handle way too many subdomains.
Right, so it's trying to do too much.
Exactly. You end up with this massive, sprawling code base that's just, well, it's a nightmare to understand, even harder to maintain. It becomes this big, tangled mess.
And what if you have the opposite problem, where a single subdomain is split across multiple bounded contexts? I can imagine that would create a communication nightmare, with different teams constantly needing to sync up and, potentially even working at cross purposes.
Oh, absolutely. That's a recipe for disaster. You get inconsistencies in how you're modeling and implementing different parts of the domain. You might end up with conflicting terminology or, even worse, different data models for the same concepts. It's a headache waiting to happen.
So it sounds like it's really important to be mindful of those potential mismatches and try to minimize them as much as possible.
Absolutely. And that's why those heuristics for validating those bounded context boundaries are so valuable. They help us catch those potential problems early on so we can adjust our design before things get too messy.
Yeah.
It's much easier to change course early on than to try to untangle a mess later down the road.
Makes sense. Now, the source material also talks about bounded contexts having their own local architectural drivers. What does that mean?
Oh, that's an important point. You see, it builds on what we talked about earlier with those overall system-level architectural drivers. It's the same idea, but on a smaller scale. Each bounded context might have its own specific set of non-functional requirements, things like performance needs, scalability concerns, security requirements, you name it. Even things like compliance with specific regulations can come into play.
So a bounded context that handles sensitive customer data might have much stricter security requirements than one that manages, say, public product information. Makes sense.
Exactly. And those local drivers are going to influence your technology choices for each bounded context. It's all about fitting the tool to the task.
So instead of using a one-size-fits-all approach for the whole system, you're tailoring your technical solutions to the specific needs of each context. That might mean using a relational database for one context and a NoSQL database for another, or choosing a specific framework that's optimized for performance in a context where speed is critical.
Exactly. You're thinking like an architect now. It's about finding the right tool for the job, considering each context's unique constraints and needs.
Okay, I like that, being adaptable. But hold on, this is reminding me of something you mentioned earlier. You said that bounded contexts don't always have to be implemented as separate microservices.
Right. I remember.
You said they could exist as modules within a larger, more traditional application, even a monolith.
That's right. It all depends on the context. You have to weigh the technical factors, consider the team structure, even the overall culture of the organization. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
So even if we're not building a microservices architecture, we can still benefit from those bounded context principles by creating those logical boundaries in our code.
Absolutely. It's about applying those principles of modularity, separation of concerns, clear communication, no matter what technology you choose. A well-designed monolith with clear bounded contexts can be much easier to work with than a poorly structured one that tries to cram everything together. Trust me, I've seen both.
This idea of having local architectural drivers for each bounded context raises an interesting question for me. If each context is potentially using different technologies, different design patterns, how do we keep things from becoming too fragmented? How do you ensure some consistency across the whole system? It seems like it could easily spiral out of control.
That's a really important point.
Right.
You're right. You don't want your system turning into a Frankenstein's monster of different technologies and approaches. While giving each bounded context the freedom to choose the best solution for its needs is great, you also need to maintain some system-wide consistency. It's a balancing act, no doubt about it.
So it's about finding that balance between autonomy and coherence, right? Allowing for flexibility without letting the system become a hodgepodge of unrelated components.
You got it. And there are a few key things you can do to maintain that balance. Strategies to keep things on track.
All right, I'm all ears. How do you walk that tightrope?
Well, first off, you absolutely need to establish clear guidelines and principles for architectural decisions. Think things like preferred technology stacks, go-to design patterns, coding standards, even deployment practices. You need that shared vocabulary.
So it's like setting up some guardrails, right? Making sure that even though each context has some freedom to make choices, those choices are still aligned with the overall direction of the system.
That's a great way to put it. It's about boundaries, but not stifling creativity. You want to give teams the power to make the best decisions for their contexts, but you don't want those decisions to fragment the system.
That makes a lot of sense. How do you enforce those guidelines in practice? Is it just documentation, or are there more, proactive things you can do?
Documentation is crucial, of course, but you can also use tools and automation. Static code analysis to check for compliance with those coding standards, automated build pipelines to enforce architectural patterns, things like that.
So you're building those quality checks right into the development process, catching those issues early before they become big problems.
Precisely. And let's not forget the human element. Communication and collaboration are still key, even with bounded contexts.
Right, regular cross-team meetings, communities of practice where developers can share knowledge and learn from each other, share documentation repositories, all those things that help break down silos and get everyone on the same page.
You nailed it. It's all about creating those channels for sharing knowledge, best practices, even those lessons learned.
Mm.
The more you can foster a culture of open communication, the better equipped you'll be to handle the complexity of a system with multiple bounded contexts.
This makes me think about the role of the architect in a system with multiple bounded contexts. It seems like their role would shift from, being the sole designer of the entire system to more of a facilitator and guide, helping teams make those local decisions while keeping an eye on the big picture.
That's a really sharp observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, the architect's role changes. It becomes less about dictating every little detail and more about empowering those teams, providing guidance, setting those strategic directions. They're like the conductor of an orchestra, making sure everyone is playing in harmony.
I love that analogy, and I imagine the shift in the architect's role requires a different skill set, more focus on communication, collaboration, strategic thinking, rather than just deep technical knowledge.
Absolutely. It's about being a leader, a mentor, a champion for those architectural principles rather than just a tech guru. You need to be able to see the big picture and understand the nuances of each individual bounded context. It's a delicate balance.
And in a way, that mirrors the bigger shift we're seeing in software development as a whole, right? Moving away from those rigid top-down approaches and towards more agile, collaborative ways of working.
You're exactly right. Bounded contexts are a great example of how we can embrace those decentralized, team-centric approaches without sacrificing consistency and integrity. It's about finding that balance between freedom and structure.
So to sum it up, if you do a good job defining those bounded contexts, organizing your teams effectively, and establishing those clear architectural guidelines, you can have the benefits of modularity and autonomy without sacrificing consistency and maintainability. It's like you get the best of both worlds.
You put it perfectly. It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance, where all the pieces come together to create a system that's both robust and adaptable, a system that can grow and evolve along with the business.
That's a crucial point. It highlights how bounded contexts aren't just a technical solution, they're a strategic tool for aligning your software with ever-changing needs of the business.
Exactly. They help break down those walls between the tech side and the business side, creating a shared understanding and making sure your software is actually solving the right problems.
This whole discussion has really got me thinking about software architecture in a broader sense. It's clearly more than just choosing technologies and frameworks. It's about
Mhm.
understanding the problem, the business goals, the team dynamics, all of it.
You're absolutely right. Software architecture is about finding solutions that work for everyone. The business, the users, the developers. It's about building systems that are functional and elegant, systems that are a joy to work with and a pleasure to use.
I like that, and it sounds like bounded contexts are a key part of that. They give you a framework for thinking about system design in a more holistic and strategic way.
Exactly. They help you create systems that are not just well-structured, but also aligned with the goals and values of the organization. It's about building something meaningful.
This has been eye-opening, really. Before we move on, though, I have one more question about bounded contexts. You've mentioned several times that defining them is an iterative process. It's not a one and done kind of thing.
Oh, definitely not. Bounded contexts are not set in stone. They need to evolve as your understanding of the problem grows and the needs of the business change. They need to be able to adapt.
So, how do you know when it's time to revisit your bounded contexts? What are some signs that maybe your boundaries need tweaking?
Well, there are a few things to look out for. One is increased complexity within a context. If a particular context starts to become too big, too hard to understand, too tangled up with other contexts, it might be time to consider splitting it up.
So, it's like a city, right? When a city gets too big, you start dividing it into smaller, more manageable districts.
Exactly. It's about managing that growth. And you might also notice communication breakdowns between teams. If teams are constantly stepping on each other's toes or can't agree on what words mean, it could be a sign that your bounded contexts aren't aligned with how people are actually working.
Right, so the structure isn't reflecting reality. It's like trying to govern a city with a single set of rules that doesn't account for the unique needs of each neighborhood. You need a system that reflects how people actually live and work.
You're getting it. And sometimes you'll run into those mismatches between subdomains and bounded contexts that we talked about earlier. If a subdomain is spread across multiple contexts, or a context is trying to cover too many unrelated subdomains, it's time to rethink those boundaries. It's all about finding that balance between clarity and flexibility.
So this process of revisiting and refining bounded contexts, it's not just about improving the technical design, right? It's about making sure your software is still supporting the business.
Absolutely. As the business changes, the software has to adapt. By regularly checking in on your bounded context, you can make sure the system stays aligned with those changes. It's like making sure the city's infrastructure can keep up with growth and development.
Those analogies really help to understand how bounded contexts fit into the bigger picture. So they're a powerful tool, but are there any downsides? Are there times when this approach might not be the best fit?
You're right, bounded contexts are powerful, but they're not a magic bullet. Like any tool, you need to use them wisely and understand their limitations. There are definitely situations where they might not be the best fit.
I'm curious to hear about those limitations. When would bounded contexts not be the ideal solution?
Well, for really small projects, projects with minimal complexity, the benefits of bounded context might not outweigh the extra effort. It's like using a bulldozer to plant a few flowers, overkill.
Right, right. What are some other situations where they might not be the right tool for the job?
Sometimes the domain itself might not be well suited to clear boundaries. If the problem space is constantly changing or you don't fully understand it yet, defining those contexts up front can be tough. It's like trying to draw a map of a landscape that keeps shifting.
So in those cases, it's better to be more exploratory, let those boundaries emerge organically as you learn more.
Exactly. You need to adapt to the situation.
Mm.
And another scenario where bounded context might be less useful is when you have a lot of integration with external systems.
So if your system relies heavily on external APIs or data sources, you might not have as much control over those boundaries. It's like trying to plan a city without knowing where the highways and railroads are going to be.
Another great analogy. In those cases, you might need to adjust your approach. Focus more on managing those external dependencies rather than trying to enforce strict internal boundaries. It's about being flexible.
So bounded contexts aren't a cure-all, but they're a valuable tool to have. They help us tackle complexity, improve communication, and create systems that are more adaptable and easier to maintain.
Couldn't agree more. They're all about bringing order to chaos, creating clarity, and building systems that can truly stand the test of time.
This has been a fascinating exploration of bounded contexts. I feel like I've learned so much.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think we've set the stage for the next part of our deep dive where we can explore some of the technical details of bounded context.
I'm ready to keep going.
Yeah.
But before we move on, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners about the role of bounded context in the bigger picture?
Sure. Think about all the systems you use every day. Online shopping, social media, all of it. They're probably built using these very principles. Can you spot the bounded contexts? Thinking about software this way gives you a deeper understanding of how it works, how it's put together, and even why it sometimes fails.
It's like becoming a software detective, uncovering the hidden structures beneath the surface.
Exactly. And the more we understand about those structures, the better we'll be at building better, more resilient systems that are truly user-friendly. It's an exciting challenge.
Okay, so let's get back to those bounded contexts. We've talked a lot about the strategy, the why behind them. Now I want to get into the nitty-gritty, the how. How do we actually build these things in a real system? How do they go from concept to code?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer, as with most things in software, is, well, it depends. There are tons of different ways to implement bounded context, and the best way for you is going to depend on the technologies you're using, how complex the domain is, even the structure of your team. There's no one right way.
Okay, so no silver bullet. But can you give me some general strategies? What are some common approaches or patterns that developers use to implement bounded contexts?
Sure. One common approach is to treat each bounded context as its own separate module or component in your code base. This could be a package in Java, a namespace in C#, a gem in Ruby, whatever structure makes sense in your language and framework. The idea is to create those clear boundaries.
So even if we're not doing like a full-blown microservices architecture, we can still use modularity to create those logical boundaries in our code.
Exactly. And that modular approach has a lot of advantages. It keeps the code for each context nice and organized, makes it easier to understand, easier to maintain. Plus, it helps prevent those accidental dependencies between contexts that can make your system really fragile and difficult to change. You want to keep things clean.
Makes sense. But what about when those modules need to talk to each other? How do you handle that communication between contexts in a way that doesn't create tight coupling? Because that would defeat the whole purpose of bounded contexts, right?
Right, that's where it gets a bit trickier. You need to be careful. There are a few different patterns you can use to manage that inter-context communication. One common one is to use well-defined APIs or interfaces. Each context exposes a clear set of functions or services that other contexts can call. It's like a contract between them.
So instead of contexts directly accessing each other's data or internal workings, they talk through these well-defined entry points.
Exactly. And that really helps maintain that separation and autonomy between contexts. Plus, it gives you the flexibility to change the internal implementation of a context without breaking other parts of the system. As long as you keep those public APIs consistent, everything keeps working.
Okay, that's clever. What other communication patterns are out there? What else do people use?
Another popular one, especially in those distributed systems, is asynchronous messaging or event-driven architecture. So instead of contexts directly calling each other, they publish events that other contexts can subscribe to and react to. It's a more loosely coupled way of doing things.
It's like they're broadcasting a message, hey, something happened over here. And other contexts can decide if they want to listen and take action.
That's a perfect way to put it, and this approach has a lot of benefits, especially for decoupling and scalability. Contexts don't need to know about each other directly. They just agree on a common format for those events, a shared language, and the system becomes much more flexible and resilient.
It also seems like it would be a good fit for systems that have to handle a large volume of events or transactions. Those events can be processed in the background without slowing everything down.
Exactly. Event-driven architectures are really gaining popularity these days for those reasons. They're great for modern systems that need to be highly scalable and responsive.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the way you implement bounded contexts can also depend on how your team is structured. Can you say more about that?
Sure. If you've got a team that's organized around bounded contexts, with each team owning a specific context, then implementing those contexts as separate microservices often makes a lot of sense.
So each team has its own code base, its own deployment pipeline, its own little world where they can make decisions about their context without stepping on anyone's toes.
Precisely. And that can be great for fostering ownership and accountability within the team. Teams can move faster, iterate more quickly. They're not bogged down by dependencies on other teams.
But what if your team structure isn't so neatly aligned with your bounded contexts? What if you've got a smaller team that's responsible for multiple contexts? Does that happen often?
Oh, yeah, all the time. In those cases, it might not be practical to implement each context as a separate microservice. You might be better off sticking with a more modular approach within a single code base, even if those modules are designed with that microservice-like mindset.
So you're still applying those principles of separation, autonomy, well-defined interfaces, but you're doing it within a more centralized code base. It's about pragmatism.
Exactly. Finding the right balance for your situation. You need to consider your team structure, your technical constraints, the overall complexity of the problem you're solving. It's not one size fits all.
This is making me realize that implementing bounded context is not about following a rigid set of rules. It's more about understanding the principles and applying them intelligently. It's about being adaptable.
You got it.
Yeah.
You have to be pragmatic. Find solutions that balance flexibility, maintainability, and performance. It's a juggling act.
Okay, so we've talked about different ways to implement bounded contexts. But what about the ongoing management and evolution of them? Our understanding of the domain changes, business requirements change. How do we keep those bounded contexts in sync with all those changes? It seems like a moving target.
Right, and that's where those heuristics we discussed earlier become really important. You need to regularly check in on your bounded contexts. Are the boundaries still clear? Is the language still consistent? Are the teams still aligned with the context they're responsible for? It's a constant process of evaluation.
So it's like a continuous feedback loop, right?
Yeah.
Checking in, making adjustments, keeping things on track.
Exactly. Sometimes those adjustments are small, like tweaking a boundary or refining some terminology. But sometimes you need to make bigger changes, like splitting a context in two or maybe merging two contexts that have gotten too intertwined. It's about being responsive to change.
There's a lot of flexibility in this approach, isn't there? It's not rigid.
That's one of the things I love about bounded contexts. They're not these rigid constraints. They're tools for understanding and managing complexity. And they can adapt as our understanding of the problem evolves and the needs of the business change. They grow with you.
This has been incredibly helpful, really. I feel like I have a much better grasp of what bounded contexts are, why they matter, and how to actually work with them in a real project. Is there anything else you'd like to add about bounded context before we wrap up? Any parting words of wisdom?
Just this. Don't be afraid to experiment. Bounded contexts are powerful, but it takes practice to really master them. You're not going to get them perfect right away. Be willing to try things out, learn from what doesn't work, and adjust your approach. It's all part of the process.
Great advice. And I think that applies to software development in general, right? Be curious, be open to learning, and be willing to adapt to new information and challenges. Never stop learning.
Absolutely. Now remember, the journey is just as important as the destination. Figuring out those bounded contexts is a learning experience, and it can lead to a much deeper understanding of the problem you're trying to solve, and ultimately, a more robust and adaptable system. It's worth the effort.
Well said. This has been a fantastic deep dive into bounded contexts. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I know our listeners have learned a lot today.
It was my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about bounded contexts and the power of strategic DDD. It's a passion of mine.
And with that, we'll bring this episode of the Deep Dive to a close. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of bounded contexts. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the exciting world of software development.